Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas joins me. Good morning, Senator. Welcome back.
Good morning, Hugh. It's good to be back on with you, and a happy new year to you. And all your listeners.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator, I want to begin with Joe Biden yesterday at Mother Emanuel Church. President Bumble said, "I'm quietly working with Israel to significantly lower IDF presence in Gaza." That was not in his script. It did not help Israel. It's not true. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's just an example of how Joe Biden's not up for the job. He stumbles and bumbles around in public. He's doing barely one event per day. He's clearly overmatched by events. He just went almost an entire week without even knowing that his Secretary of Defense was in the intensive care unit and unable to perform the duties of his position. I think the American people recognize that Joe Biden's not just responsible for their high inflation and their wide open border, and in large part responsible for the chaos you see around the world, but he simply can't do the job, whatever his other policy failings are.
I agree with this, and that's why I call him President Bumble. And I know you're a senator, you can't do that, but everything is like Mr. Magoo in the presidency, and it's becoming alarming. Let's turn to Secretary Austin. Senator, you served in the military. Would any captain in the Navy or admiral, any colonel in the Army or general be relieved of command if they went AWOL for 5 days and did not tell their superior officer?
Well, Hugh, this, again, a shocking breakdown in communications in the chain of command. The Secretary of Defense is not the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He's not the Secretary of Transportation. He's the key link between the civilian commander-in-chief and the uniformed military, to include in the nuclear chain of command when the weightiest decisions imaginable might have to be made in a matter of minutes. And imagine if Joe Biden says, "I need to speak to the Secretary of Defense immediately," and they put Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary, on from Puerto Rico, and he's like, Joe Biden of all people is like, "Who is this and why am I talking to you?" When literally seconds count. Now, Secretary Austin commanded at all levels in the Army, and one thing that I think he's going to have to answer for is if he was a brigade commander and it turned out that one of his battalion commanders had gone in for an elective surgery and he hadn't been notified, and then he had to be readmitted because of complications and turn over responsibility to his executive officer, and the brigade commander, Lloyd Austin, wasn't notified of that, what would happen with that battalion commander and his executive officer and his sergeant major? I think the question answers itself.
It
It's
does.
not entirely clear what the facts are here yet and who all needs to be held responsible, but plainly, people have to be held responsible at the Department of Defense.
And it makes especially more sense when one considers the Houthis are trying to sink our ships. They're shooting at us every day. American soldiers are under fire every day. This war is hot. The war in Ukraine is hot. Anything could happen. The chain of command was basically broken for 5 days. It's astonishing. I've never seen anything like it.
And Hugh, I've spoken with several people who've held positions in and around the Secretary of Defense of the White House, former national security advisors, chiefs of staff, senior military assistants to the Secretary of Defense. All of them agree that this is an unimaginable breach of the chain of command and of basic reporting. Again, we don't even know what procedure it was that Secretary Austin elected to have. And there should be a pretty good reason for it to have if you're the Secretary of Defense. Obviously, if it's life-threatening or important for health, that has to happen. But if it's something that could have waited for a year, I think he needs to answer for that decision as well. But no matter what your procedure is, Hugh, if it's just having a root canal, if you're in a position like the Secretary of State or the CIA Director or the Secretary of Defense, you have to have a contingency plan if something goes wrong. You have to give the President or the National Security Advisor heads up. You have to tell your subordinates, if something goes wrong while I'm under anesthesia, make sure you do the following very simple things. And it's just such a breach of sound, simple judgment on such a simple matter. It really raises questions about the Secretary's judgment on bigger matters and the judgment of those around him as well, at a time, as you say, that we're in a hot shooting war.
Especially when President Biden is in South Carolina making up policy on Israel that Israel wasn't aware of. Senator, last week you announced your endorsement of former President Trump to become the nominee of the Republican Party. Why last week? Why President Trump?
Well, Hugh, it's a pretty clear contrast between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Under President Trump, we had a booming economy, real working class wages were growing, our border was secure, and our enemies feared us, and we had peace and stability, largely speaking, around the world. Under President Biden, everything has gone to hell, and everyone can see it. Inflation has run amok. Families can't afford their groceries. The border's wide open. We had over 300,000 people crossing our country last year, and there is war everywhere, in no small part because no one is afraid of Joe Biden. Vladimir Putin thinks he can invade Ukraine with impunity. Iran thinks it can unleash its proxies against Israel with impunity. Xi Jinping thinks that he can go up to the line against Taiwan with impunity. So it's a clear contrast for the American people. Do you want the peace, prosperity, and strength that we had in the Trump era, or do you want 4 more years of the chaos and incompetence, the inflation, and the threats that we have under Joe Biden?
You mentioned 300,000 crossed the border last year. I think you meant 3 million. By my
300,000 last month, just last month. So
last
on an
month,
annualized
okay.
basis, Hugh,
Right.
that's 3.6 million on an annualized basis. Just think about that. That is the entire population of my state, Arkansas, plus a Vermont thrown in just for good measure.
I can't imagine that. That's one of the big issues. That's why I want to ask you about the immigration deal. I've talked to a number of senators, and John Kennedy and everyone else tells me they don't know what's in it. I know that if it comes out and it does not have 900 miles of border wall paid for and constructed before anything else happens, it's dead on arrival. Have you talked to Senator Tillis or Senator Lankford about this so-called immigration deal?
Senator Lankford has kept us apprised of the broad contours he's negotiating. I'm not sitting down with Chris Murphy or Chuck Schumer, in part because Chuck Schumer often refuses to sit down with me, as happened in the Trump era, because he knows I want to throw in the towel and just go for a deal because I want a deal for a deal's sake. I'm worried right now, most of all, that the Democrats are continuing to refuse to have any reforms to the parole system. I agree with you that we need to finish the wall where walls are critical, but a threshold issue is whether or not the Democrats are going to agree to reforms of the parole system, which the president has abused to allow hundreds of thousands of migrants in this country. Because to have asylum reform without parole reform, Hugh, is like damming the left-hand side of a river.
I agree. I agree. There are some must-haves, necessary but not sufficient, and that is one of them. The wall is another one of them, and I just don't think they should put us through this if they can't get to yes. If they can't get to yes, let's take it to the electorate because the electorate agrees with us. Finally, Senator, I've started a new column over at Fox News every Tuesday and Thursday, and today I have a list of 6 names. I want former President Trump, if he locks up, that's a big if, Nikki Haley is surging, Governor DeSantis is still in the race, but if President Trump locks this up by the end of Super Tuesday voting, I would like him to name his running mate and the rest of his cabinet, but especially his running mate early, so that we can have someone out there raising money and driving the narrative when he's in court. What do you think?
Well, Hugh, I won't presume to tell Donald Trump how to run his campaign, especially how to make critical choices like vice president and his cabinet positions. I'll trust him to do what he thinks is the best to help achieve the goal that we all share, which is beating Joe Biden and the Democrats in November. And he'll make a decision, I'm sure, sometime in vice president in the next 6 months or so before the convention, and then obviously for cabinet positions immediately after the election. The key priority right now is uniting the party and beating Joe Biden.
That is the key priority, but I think it would help. I mean, he is going to be in court, and when you're in court, by the way, let me divert for a second. Fannie Wills has been shown to be corrupt. She hired her boyfriend, apparently, according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and other reports, and paid him a lot of money. Do you think that undermines the indictment, even though it's not specific to the indictment?
Well, obviously, it undermines everything about Fannie Wills' tenure as a district attorney in Atlanta, and it certainly undermines the highly politicized indictment of Donald Trump and many of those around him. I assume that there's going to be some kind of investigation now. I'm not sure the structure of Georgia's government, who would conduct that investigation, but it seems to me like she's got a lot to answer for. And once again, Donald Trump's opponents and accusers are largely engaged in projection, attacking him for corruption or making these kind of false allegations. And in return, their own house is deeply disordered. I mean, apparently she was paying her lover hundreds of thousands of dollars to prosecute Donald Trump, and then going on fancy vacations and splurging on luxury items. I mean, this is the woman that the people of Atlanta get for their district attorney. I think they deserve a lot better than that. And certainly Donald Trump and all those people who were indicted on this politicized witch hunt deserve a lot better.
Yeah, my first reaction was that does not go to the merits of the indictment. But my second reaction is, yeah, it does. It gives you a motive to indict someone. If you're going to hire your boyfriend and funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars to him, that calls into question the motive behind the indictment. Do you think someone from the governor's office ought to look at this?
Someone should look at it. Again, I don't know what the structure of Georgia's government is and who is the appropriate authority to investigate misconduct by a local DA, whether that's the governor or the legislature or the attorney general or some independent prosecutorial commission. I just don't know what the structure of Georgia's government is, but someone certainly needs to look at it because, as you say, it clearly undermines the integrity of not just Donald Trump's indictment, but the indictment of all those others, like Mark Meadows, his former chief of staff. It gives them a clear financial and personal interest when Fannie Wills is paying off her lover to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars on this politicized witch hunt to get Donald Trump and all of his aides so she can go on fancy cruises or trips to the Caribbean or whatever it was and buy all the luxury goods she wanted and continue to have a positive relationship with her lover. I mean, the whole thing just stinks like a rotting carcass.
Every time we talk about these trials, it goes that way. Senator Tom Cotton, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. Keep coming back. Send Tom Cotton on X, the site formerly known as Twitter, if you want to keep up on what Senator Cotton is up to.